Good morning, folks who are signed in already. We're going to be starting in just a few moments. We're going to give more people a chance to sign in. For anyone just joining, we're going to give it another couple minutes just to give more folks a chance to join on. And it's just about 11, but bear with us. We're going to give it another minute or so before we get started. Good morning for anyone that just joined on. We're going to get started. I know I keep saying this, but we're going to get started any moment now. So bear with us just for a couple more minutes just to let people trickle in. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's about 11:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today, especially on a Saturday. My name is Lisa Frank, and I'm a senior planner in the Community Development Department. Today's workshop is regarding the update to the city's housing element of the general plan. And as noted on the slide here, we're also going to be mentioning some of the other general plan updates that the state law will require us to undertake, such as the safety element and new requirements to address environmental justice. Because this is the first community workshop that we're doing on this update process, the main purpose is an opportunity to share information, again, primarily about the housing element, as well as to provide multiple opportunities for your input and questions throughout. Today we have a number of staff members on the line from the Community Development Department as well as from our consultant team. I'll just list off names so that we can continue through the presentation. But we'll have from Planning, Fred Ramirez, Scott Planbeck, Xavier Thomas, Shipra Rajesh, and Maciel Medina. And with Housing, we have Maribel Leyland. And then from our consultant team, we're joined by Karen Warner and John Oshimo from Karen Warner Associates, and Lexi Journey and Joe Power from Rincon Consultants. Next slide, please. And as we're loading the slide, I'm going to spend the next few minutes just going through some housekeeping items, so please bear with me here. Before we begin, we want to see if there are any language services that might be needed, which includes an option for Spanish or Armenian. And we'll start with Maciel. Maciel, would you please explain the instructions for Spanish?
Sure, thank you, Lisa. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Si desea escuchar la presentación en español, oprima el botón de la pantalla que se muestra aquí en la diapositiva y selecciona español. También oprima el botón que dice silenciar audio original que se muestra con la flecha roja para que solo me escuche hablar en español. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Maciel. And Lilia, would you be able to explain that in Armenian, please?
Անարդյոք ներկաների թվում որևիցե անձեր, ովքեր կարիք ունեն հայերեն լեզվի թարգմանության, եթե կարիք ունեք թարգմանության, խնդրեմ ձեր էկրանի երևացող ընտրությունից ընտրեք ֆրանսերեն, French, որպեսզի կարողանաք ամենը տեսնել հայերեն լեզվով, նաև հաջորդը, որը սրակը ցույց է տալի, պետք է անջատեք ձեր միկրոֆոնի ձայնը, որպեսզի կարողանաք լսել միայն հայերեն լեզվով։ Շնորհակալություն։
Thank you very much. We'll just give a few moments in case anyone needs to access the Spanish or Armenian. So you don't need to let us know, but if on your screen, you can make that selection.
Ձեր էկրանի վրա խնդրեմ արեք այդ ընտրությունը։ Նորից հայերենի համար պետք է ընտրեք ֆրանսերեն բառը։
Thank you. And Lexi, if you can now start the interpretation. And then we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble seeing the language option right now.
Okay.
It was up there. Apologize for technical difficulties. I see in the Q&A that seems like participants also don't see that selection.
I think we have to enable it in order for them to see it. Okay, I'm going to switch. Sorry, everyone. Please bear with us. We appreciate your patience.
Lisa, is there anyone who selected French for Armenian?
I think we're just waiting till it's enabled so that they can make the selection if they need to.
Okay.
But Lexi, if you want to switch me, here we go. One moment.
Yeah, I switched over to you now.
Okay. Okay, so attendees should be able to see that selection now. And then we can proceed. Thank you. So okay, so as you can see, we're having some technical difficulties, and I was going to mention, just please bear with us for that. We should be smooth from here on out. But this workshop is going to run for about an hour and a half, and we're going to begin with a presentation, which to make things a little bit more interactive throughout, we'll also be doing some live polling questions that you can respond to from your computer or cell phone anonymously. And after the presentation, we will have a question and comment period. So that everyone is aware, this is being recorded and also live streamed on the city's YouTube channel as well as local cable channel. And we'll post that recording on the website following the meeting. And then lastly, all of today's participants will be entered into a raffle for gift cards to local eateries in downtown Burbank. We will announce and contact the winners in the days following the meeting, so not today. Next slide. Okay, so just a little bit more about the opportunities to share input. There's going to be a few different ways. One is that we're going to break up the presentation and take 5-minute question and answer breaks. So we'll take about 3 questions each for those, and because there's a shorter amount of time, we'll just take the question, respond, and then go to the next person if anyone else has questions. And so you'll know when those breaks come up because we'll announce them, and I will go through the instructions for that when the time comes, but you're going to use the raise hand feature for that in order to request to speak. The Q&A panel, the Q&A icon will always be enabled. You should be able to click on that and you can send questions through that at any point during the meeting. If we don't get to those questions that you send through the Q&A during the meeting, we're going to compile all of them and provide responses following the meeting. So if we don't get to you today, or if you don't want to speak, but you still want to send in a question, you can send that through the Q&A. During the presentation, as I mentioned, we're also going to do some live polling questions. And then you can always contact us after this. I'm going to provide the email again at the end of the presentation, but there's an email at housingelement@burbankca.gov. Next slide. Okay, so let's get started. Some of you may already be familiar with the general plan, and others maybe not as familiar. So the general plan is a state-required policy document that provides guidance in shaping the future physical growth and development of the city. It's made up of chapters or elements, many of which are required by state law, such as housing, land use, mobility, safety, noise, and open space. Burbank's general plan is called Burbank 2035, and it was adopted by the City Council in 2013. Of all the elements of the general plan, the housing element is unique because it's required to be updated on a fixed schedule every 8 years. And so we're here because our housing element extended from 2014 through 2021, and it's therefore due for that required update. And Karen will go into more detail on this in her presentation. In addition to the housing element, several other state bills in recent years require the city to make some other general plan updates concurrent with the housing element update, and that includes the revising the safety element as well as incorporating environmental justice goals and policies into the general plan. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more on the safety element. The general plan safety element will be updated to comply with recent state laws that took effect, and these require cities to evaluate the potential risks of climate change in their jurisdictions over time, such as increased flooding potential or extreme heat, for example. Key areas to be updated include fire and flooding hazards, as well as emergency response and preparedness, especially as they relate to the city's projected climate change vulnerabilities. So the purpose of this is to evaluate the potential climate change risks in the city and to develop goals and policies to help address them, including any programs that the city might already be doing, such as updating evacuation strategies and fire maps. So with that, we are going to launch our first poll. And Lexi, if you could launch that, please, or maybe I can do that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the first question is, how long have you lived in Burbank?
Առաջին հարցը ինչքան երկար եք ապրել Բրբանկում։
Okay, we'll just give a moment for people to respond. And that was either 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, 11 to 20 years, 21 plus years. Or maybe you work in Burbank but live in another city.
Հնարավոր է աշխատում եք Բրբանկում, բայց ապրում եք ուրիշ քաղաքում։
Okay. Still see a couple responses coming in. Okay, so I think we can, Lexi, if you can share the results.
Ահա արդյունքները։
Okay, so it looks like the majority of people responded that they have lived in Burbank for over 21 years. And then some folks between 11 to 20 years and 6 to 10 years. And it looks like a couple people responded 1 to 2 years. Okay, can we move on to the second poll, Lexi?
I did.
Good morning. Can we take the poll down? Oh, you're doing the second poll.
Okay, it looks like some people are already responding. Sorry about that. The second question was, what type of housing unit do you live in? A detached single-family house, a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, a condominium or townhome,
Երկրորդ հարցն է, ինչ տեսակի տան մեջ եք ապրում։
an apartment, an accessory dwelling unit or guest house, assisted living, or you work in Burbank but live in another city, or none of the above. Okay, we'll give it another moment. And Lexi, could you share the poll, please? Okay, so it looks like 53% said detached single-family house, and 24% duplex, triplex, or fourplex, 12% condominium or townhome, and 6% apartments, as well as work in Burbank and live in another city. Okay, thank you for your participation, and with that, I will turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Lisa. Lexi, can you put up the next slide? Thank you. I'd like to begin by providing some context for Burbank's housing element. In 2017, the Burbank City Council approved an affordable housing strategy. And what this strategy showed was the city's had rapid employment growth, and associated with that has been a rapid rise in the cost of housing. The combined factors of employment growth and limited new housing production contributed to a widening gap between jobs and housing in the city. For reference, the city's jobs housing ratio is 2.9 jobs for every housing unit, which is higher than Mountain View, San Francisco, and all of the other cities on the bar chart there. So with this housing strategy, in 2019, the City Council established a goal to facilitate the building of 12,000 new housing units over the next 15-year period. Both the housing strategy and this 12,000 housing unit production goal will be integrated into the new 2021-2029 housing element, also referred to as the sixth cycle housing element, through the element's identification of sites for future development and the identification of programs to facilitate development and address Burbank's wide-ranging housing needs. Next slide. So what exactly is the housing element? As Lisa mentioned, it's part of the Burbank 2035 General Plan, and it consists of 5 major components: a review of accomplishments under the adopted element, a detailed housing needs assessment evaluating the existing and projected housing needs in the community, an evaluation of any potential constraints to housing development, the identification of housing sites, and then an 8-year program strategy to address needs. Unlike other general plan elements, the housing element is required to undergo state review for compliance with very lengthy and stringent requirements. The agency responsible for this review is the State Department of Housing and Community Development, also referred to as HCD. Next slide. There are significant benefits of having state HCD find your city's housing element in compliance. It provides the city a legally adequate housing element in the courts. If the courts were to invalidate a housing element, they will shut down all ability to issue building permits until the element's brought into compliance. An HCD compliant element provides protection from Attorney General litigation, which is what the city of Huntington Beach faced earlier this year. It allows the city to maintain discretionary review over affordable housing projects. It provides the city eligibility for state housing funds, and the city has recently received several different state housing grants, which it was allowed to do since it had an HCD-approved element. And it prevents the city from having what's referred to as RHNA carryover into the next housing element cycle. And we're happy to say Burbank's housing element has been certified as in compliance by the state. Next slide. It's also important to understand what the housing element does not do. It does not require the city to build the units that are planned for. However, projects may be eligible for a streamlined approval process in cities that have not made sufficient progress in addressing their growth needs. And this is under a piece of legislation referred to as SB 35. The housing element does not directly provide funding, although it does enable eligibility for state housing funds. And the housing element does not authorize construction on housing element sites. Development projects still need to go through the city approval processes. Next slide. I will turn it back over to Lisa to have our first break for questions.
Okay, thank you, Karen. We're going to take our first break for questions. So this is going to be a break to ask questions only on the material that was just presented. So we're going to likely take about 3 questions. You can use the raise hand button on your screen. I don't know if anyone's calling in, but if you are, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. If it is your turn to speak, Xavier will call your name, and you will be prompted to unmute yourself. So once that happens, you can ask your question, and then we'll provide a response and move on to the next question.
Thank you very much. First question, will Karen or Karin go ahead and ask your question?
It's Karen. Thank you very much. I wondered, in the 12,000 housing units that are planned before 2034, how does that pace to the expected future job growth? In other words, how much would it improve that 2.93 ratio?
Why don't I turn that over to the Assistant Community Development Director, Fred Ramirez.
Hi, Karen, this is Fred. Let me turn on my video just for the moment. Hello. Well, with the 3-to-1 jobs to housing ratio, if we were to actually to build and try to, get a 1-to-1 ratio, it probably wouldn't be the type of city you'd all want to live in. So the number right now with our current pace would basically make some headway and keep us in compliance with our projected regional housing need assessment number that Karen will talk about a little bit more, which jumped from a projected kind of fair share goal of building 2,600 units over the last 8 years, and it's now jumped to 8,700. So we're clearly not going to get down to a 1-to-1 ratio, but we'll at least keep pace with current growth. By example, we anticipate with recent developments, Avion Project, Media Studios North entitlements, those were looking at about 1,000 new employees in each one of those developments going forward over time. And the city of Burbank has been quite successful in actually attracting additional new employment. I think you may have all heard of Netflix now setting up stakes in the city, and that anticipates another 300 to 400 employees. There's other subcontractors that work in media. There's another 400 employees coming in through a company called Titmouse, which is also in the media production, actually animation. So I don't know if we're going to exactly keep pace per se, but we're at least going to not lose as much ground as we have been in the past, where we really didn't build out a lot of units, which I think Karen will also talk about. And the goal of 12,000 is aspirational. It's a big goal, but it's one that is consistent with what we're seeing from the state as far as what we need to build out.
Thank you.
Bruce, go on ahead and ask your question, please.
Hello. My question is on these 12,000 units, where's the electricity and the water going to come from? I mean, we all know, we're having a water shortage. We just went through, they just issued an alert here the other day for the power alert. Where's this going to come from? I mean, we're going to build another power station in town, I guess, a power unit. It's my question.
Karen, I can at least, I don't think I have an exact answer for you in the immediate. I will say that the general plan that was adopted back in 2013 through 2035 anticipated projected growth of 5,900 units. And that was planned for. The number that I mentioned as far as the 8,700 units, that was in essence our fair share requirement coming through Southern California Association of Governments and effectively from the state, is something that we have to look at that number, look at it within the context of what we have capacity for. And we have, as part of this process, an environmental assessment that we have to conduct to determine first of all, where we can place these units, where's the most effective way, consistent with council goals of being responsible in development and protecting single family neighborhoods. but at the same time being able to have the community facilities and infrastructure to be able to support that. So through this process, we'll be preparing an environmental impact report. The consultants can talk a little bit more to that, but those are very good questions, and those are things that we're going to have to look into and do a deep dive as we go through this process.
Yeah, Joe Power from Rencon here. I'll just augment what Fred just said. Yes, we're going to be assisting with the preparation of the environmental impact report that we'll embark on, we think, starting early next year. Both the topics of energy and water will both be analyzed as part of that environmental review. I don't have answers for you today in terms of energy or water availability, but those are absolutely issues that we will be investigating as part of that environmental review.
Okay, we will take one more question. Tamala, please go on ahead and ask your question.
Great, thank you. Thank you for doing this workshop today. And perhaps you're going to be answering this question later, but I was wondering, could you go into a little bit more deeper discussion about what happens if we don't meet our RHNA numbers, if we don't build the housing that's required in the city? How will that impact our city? And what is the RHNA number, that one that we're trying to get to? How will that benefit the city to meet that number?
Sure, I will try to respond to that. And we are going to be discussing the RHNA in greater detail in a moment. But most cities don't meet their RHNA numbers. I mean, they are goals. What is important is that the city set the stage, set the table through its zoning to enable that amount of growth to happen and not put undue constraints on housing production to allow the market to provide, what it's going to provide. Again, if you don't meet your RHNA number, you aren't directly penalized. What's very important is that you maintain an HCD compliant element, because you can face a lot of repercussions if the state does not approve your element.
Karen, this is Fred. Maybe you can speak to it, but I know to Ms. Takahashi's question, there have been a lot of legislative bills that have come through in the last couple of years and have actually kind of narrowed in on facilitating housing, in particular updates to the density bonus regulations and SB 35. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the question of, well, when we don't hit those RHNA numbers or we don't produce the housing, how has that kind of resulted in some of the changes in the legislation? In essence, narrowing down and focusing in on cities that haven't been good players in producing housing. If you can talk about that.
Sure. Yes, there's definitely been a trend in the legislature for more accountability in cities to address their regional housing needs. So there have been a slew of housing bills since 2017 that place the city's feet to the fire in terms of addressing housing growth. Density bonus law has changed to be much more generous. Cities that are underproducing their RHNA goals are subject to SB 35, which is by right housing development. So there's all kinds of things that the state is doing to try to get cities to help with the housing crisis that we're facing.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna and if folks have more questions, I think there's one other person with their hand raised. We're gonna keep going through the presentation, but please hold on to it either towards the end or you can send it through the Q&A. And it looks like you might have already done that. So great, we can keep going then.
Thank you very much. This is John Oshima, part of the Karen Warner Associates consulting team on this. And basically what I like to do is just give you a brief background on some information on what the current housing element has accomplished and also some housing needs trends information on that. So the following two slides, I'd like to just highlight Burbank's progress in implementing the housing element program during the first 6 years of the current housing element. During this period, which started in 2014, the Burbank Housing Corporation acquired and rehabilitated 27 very low-income units. The city also approved 3 mixed-use projects in the downtown area and one in the media district, totaling over 1,100 new apartments, of which 87 units being affordable. Also, the city approved 95 affordable units through development projects such as the First Street Village, La Tierra, and others. Also, the city adopted an accessory dwelling unit, ADU ordinance, allowing the construction of smaller units on existing residential properties. So the maximum size for an ADU, for one bedroom ADU is 850 square feet. For a 2-bedroom would be 1,000 square feet. So up to now, there's already been more than 350 ADU applications submitted to the city, and currently it's at various stages. Next slide, please. Okay. Continuing on with the accomplishments. During this period, the city also initiated 2 specific plans that focused on higher density housing near transit. And you can see from the map on the left, the yellow areas, which are highlighted, represents the Golden State and the downtown Burbank specific plan areas. The city also adopted an affordable housing analysis and strategies, which had a goal of developing 12,000 units in the next 15 years. The city adopted a 2018-2021 homelessness plan. It also adopted an eviction moratorium and a rent repayment ordinance. And the last accomplishment on this slide is the affordability extension of 3 at-risk units, basically preventing them from converting affordable units to market rate units. Next slide, please. So in terms of demographic trends, it basically relates to demographic trends related to housing needs in the city. Please note that these trends reflect pre-COVID information. So what we see here is that there is a higher proportion of single-person households. Almost 1/3 live alone. There's also a sizable younger population, ages 25 to 44 years. At the same time, Burbank is a very strong employment center, especially in the entertainment sector, with 8 of the top 10 employers in the entertainment industry, with the largest being Disney. So what basically this shows is that there is a demand for smaller, higher density, mixed-use units closer to transit centers. Next slide, please. Other demographic trends show that during this decade, renters, which are the majority of Burbank's households, have experienced slightly increased and overcrowded conditions. This is where you have more than one person per room. At the same time, there's insufficient supply of affordable, large rental units for lower income, larger households. So these trends basically highlight the need or the demand for larger affordable rental units, those being 3+ bedrooms. Next slide. This slide shows the current rent costs for the city. Based on a recent housing market report, the average rent for a 1-bedroom unit is $1,776. For a 2-bedroom unit, $2,335, and for a 3-bedroom unit, it's $3,186. These average rents exceed the moderate income affordability, and over the decade, average rents have increased, but vacancy rates have remained at around 4.5%, which is lower than the county. In addition, over one half of Burbank's renters are facing housing cost burdens, or in other words, they're overpaying, where the renter is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs and rent. Almost 1/3 of the renters are experiencing severe housing overpayment. That's where you're spending over 50% of your income on rent and other housing costs. Next slide, please. So for the workforce housing needs, Burbank has a sizable workforce population. It has limited affordable housing and a lot of jobs. It's estimated that there's over 130,000 jobs within the city, but only 45,000 housing units. So Burbank is a job-rich city. You have 2.9 jobs, almost 3 jobs for every housing unit in the city. What this creates is a daytime population that's almost double the total residential population. The optimum job housing ratio is between 0.75 to 1.50. And what this does is it reduces vehicle miles traveled, which means less commute time, less traffic, less daytime demand on infrastructure and services. Also, about 1/3 of the jobs are generally in the lower paying industries. And workers are commuting to Burbank. Almost 90% are from outside of the city, and a half of those commute more than 10 miles. So to highlight this is that there's a shortage of housing in Burbank, and therefore we're going to have to really evaluate workforce housing opportunities to reduce commute travel. And we'll do that in the upcoming housing element. Next slide. I'd like to focus on 3 of the special needs households. First is seniors. Those are 65 and over. Burbank's population is getting older. 22% of the total households are seniors. Half of the seniors are renters, of which 2/3 are very low income, and half live alone. The other special needs is persons with disabilities. There's 11,200 persons, or 11% of the population, living with disabilities. Of these disabilities, 7% are in the working age group, 40% are seniors. And of the most prevalent types of disabilities of these two groups are not being able to live independently and not being able to walk, or non-ambulatory. And the third area is the homeless population. According to the 2019 point in time homeless counts, there were 282 persons experiencing homelessness. And of those, 83% were unsheltered, and about 1/3 chronically homeless. So now we'd like to just go into the polling question number 3. And we'd like to get your input on this question. Which of these issues do you see as being Burbank's most important housing needs? And you can select more than one on these. So they include lack of affordable housing for Burbank workforce, deteriorating housing conditions, overcrowded housing, housing for homeless population, and housing for Burbank seniors and disabled population. So you can go ahead and select. Okay, so it looks like the number 1 would be, which is 77%, is the lack of affordable housing for Burbank's workforce. And the second would be housing for our homeless population. Okay. can go on to the questions and answers.
Okay, next slide. Great. So we're going to go into our next break for live questions. Again, this will be about 5 minutes, so we'll take about 3 questions specifically on the information that you just heard. So with that, Xavier, we'll see if anyone has their hand raised.
Okay, we will start with the first question going to Gina. Go on ahead and please ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Thanks again for having this meeting, and you guys do a great job, so thank you very much. My question is, where do you anticipate most of these housing units going? Location-wise. That's it.
Yeah, I think we anticipate it primarily going into those areas, the specific plan areas. Those would be, I think we mentioned the Golden State specific plan areas and the downtown specific plan areas. Those are the 2 areas that we see where there's a potential for higher density, transit-oriented type of development. Oh, and also the media district.
And I'll just add, just so everyone knows, we are going to be looking at that in more detail in sort of the next phase of this process. And we'll be holding a second workshop that is focused on looking at housing sites, which Karen's going to speak about shortly, relating to the regional housing needs assessment. But yes, as John was saying, I think the general concept would be focusing on our employment and transit centers, and opportunities for infill development in those areas in particular, as well as maybe supplementing in that with some of our ADUs and other smaller sites. But Fred, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
The only thing I was going to say, and it's a selfish plug for those other 2 long-range planning efforts, is that the Golden State Specific Plan is currently going through a public input and community outreach effort. So if you go to our website, city's website, you'll see both the webpage for the Golden State Specific Plan, as well as one for the downtown Burbank transit-oriented development specific plan. So it's actually, everything's dovetailing, coming together at the right time. So as you participate in this process, you can also, we'd encourage you to participate in those where we're going to basically look in greater detail into those areas as to where we can accommodate housing while still protecting and preserving the existing neighborhoods. The intent is not just to build buildings, right, to have all these housing units, but to do it in a way that we either enhance or create new neighborhoods in those areas. Thank you.
Okay. Arby, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, my question is regarding parking. Have we talked about parking, especially for the ADUs? I mean, those units doesn't need any parking, but all these units that needs to be built, what is city's plan regarding parking for City of Burbank? Thank you.
Lisa, I can chime in if you like.
Sure. Go ahead, Fred.
So, Arby, we're going to be looking at that more so through the specific plans that I just mentioned, where we're going to look at the development standards, the things that basically would apply to a project when it's submitted. But we're going to be accounting for and accommodating parking for those units. There's kind of a uniqueness to this because state law, depending on the type of project, let's say a density bonus project actually prescribes or tells us how many parking spaces we can require of a developer. But through these outreach efforts under the specific plan, we'll be looking at ways to use parking through parking management more efficiently, and looking at best practices to see how these projects, including mixed use projects and infill projects in these areas, how they basically are being built throughout the region and the state. So we're going to be looking at best practices, but I encourage you to participate in those discussions as well. But understood, as much as we want to encourage people to use alternate modes of transportation, we still have to account for the vehicle, especially in car-centric California and Southern California. So thank you.
And last question, Karen, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thanks. I have a question about ADUs and the regulation. If there were like 350 housing units approved, how can we be assured that those can really go against the housing count? So in other words, how can we be sure that they are housing permanent residents of Burbank rather than just travelers? I'm not sure the laws that are in place, but personally, I know I've rented at least, nearly a dozen, quote unquote, like ADU Airbnbs in the city of Burbank for visiting family. And I feel like most residences that are building ADUs are looking at it as a short-term income generating tool.
Thanks for the question. I can start it off and then Fred or anyone if you want to add. But yeah, it's a good point, and it's something that some of you may be aware. The city is also, at the same time as we're doing this, we're also looking at the short-term rental regulations, understanding that that's been something going on in the city as it relates to ADUs. But as far as our regulations, we don't allow them as short-term rentals. In a nutshell, they're meant to be long-term units for residents. And that's kind of codified through the regulations themselves, which have language about the minimum amount of days that the lease would require. So it's not to say that there's never folks that are doing, not abiding by that, but the purpose of the ADUs is really not for short-term rentals, but more so for the actual dwelling units. But yeah, Fred or anyone, if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. This is Fred Ramirez. So one thing I will say is, to Lisa's point is, yeah, we're currently going through the development or evaluating whether we need short-term housing rental regulations. And one thing that has been brought up by the community is, and currently in our ADU regulations, is you can't rent an ADU for less than 30 days. The planning board recently is recommending to council, with kind of an update that we have on our accessory dwelling unit regulations, to up that number to not being able to rent an ADU for less than 90 days. So that'll be evaluated. But to Lisa's point, if people are doing it, they're doing it not consistent with applicable code. That ADU is granted, it's by right. In other words, the state requires us to review and process those within now a 60-day time frame. And then it becomes, at that point, really more of an enforcement issue. And I think the intent of the short-term rental, not to get too far off topic, is to look at addressing that by having those units that currently exist to be documented. And if ADUs are not going to be allowed, then they would not be able to be put on that list and would automatically be unpermitted activity. But it is a bit of a cat and mouse game with some of this. I think even with that said, the production of ADUs is going to play an important part in the 8,700 RHNA units that we mentioned earlier. So it's not just going to be all within the specific plans. And that's kind of, in a way, dictated by the state, because they've made the ability for people, individual property owners, to be able to apply for and get an ADU application process. So like anything, we build a better mousetrap and people build a better mouse. And it's a bit of an ongoing issue with enforcement, but those are good points, things that we need to look at. And we already, and Karen and Lisa can chime in greater detail, but we already get, for better or for worse, I'm going to say, credits for the ADUs towards our regional housing need assessment number, and I anticipate that will be the case moving forward.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to continue, and yeah, we can have more of a discussion on that later in the presentation as well.
Okay, speaking of RHNA, this is really the cornerstone of the housing element update. RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and these essentially are the growth projections that are developed up at the state, and the state provides these projections to the Regional Planning Agency, which in our case is SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments. And then SCAG is tasked with developing a methodology to distribute the growth projections to all of its participating cities and counties. So for this upcoming sixth cycle housing element, SCAG has a task of distributing over 1.3 million housing units. This number was appealed by SCAG to the state unsuccessfully. So that's what we're dealing with. This number is over 3 times larger than what it was during the fifth cycle. So in the housing element, you can see the map on the slide. This is the city's housing sites map from its existing element. We're required to identify sites that have zoning to accommodate the RHNA growth. And this is really one of the primary criteria that HCD uses for approving the housing element. And it's really the biggest hurdle that most cities have is identifying the sufficient sites to meet their RHNA. Next slide. So this shows what the city's RHNA is in the current element. So the third column, you see the city had a total allocation of 2,684 units. The second column shows what the income categories are in terms of dollar amount for very low, low, moderate, and above moderate income households. Looking at building permits issued for the first 6 years, that's the fourth column. The city has permitted just 501 units of its total 2,600 RHNA. And as you can see in the low and moderate income categories, those are even more limited. And actually those are primarily related to the ADUs that the city has permitted. We've conducted a rent survey in each of the last couple years and have been able to show that market rents for ADUs, many of them fall within the levels that are affordable to low and moderate income households. There are additional units coming online that will count towards the city's RHNA progress, but the bulk of the large mixed-use projects that have entitlements which will actually be counted towards the following housing element period. Next slide. So this shows what the city's draft RHNA is for the upcoming cycle. So you can see it's 8751 units. This is scheduled to be finalized and adopted by SCAG in February of this year. This allocation is like the overall SCAG allocation, more than 3 times what the city's current allocation is. It does fall within the council's goal for 12,000 new units. And fortunately for us, the city is undertaking these 2 major specific plans along transit corridors. And we're working with those planning efforts to help identify sites to address this RHNA. There's something referred to as a buffer. We need to not just identify sites for exactly 8751, we need to have a comfortable buffer above that, because as sites are developed with either fewer units than identified in the housing element or not at the same affordability level assumed in the housing element, we have to be able to demonstrate throughout the 8-year planning period that the city still has sites in the bank, so to say, to address the outstanding RHNA needs. Next slide. And now we're going to go to a polling question related to how the city's going to meet this 8,700 number. So what strategies should the city pursue to meet its RHNA obligation? And you can select multiple answers. Increase densities near transit, increase densities in multifamily zone neighborhoods, allowing slightly increased densities in single-family neighborhoods to reduce the number of multifamily sites needed, incentives for accessory dwelling units, motel conversions into housing, and tiny homes or micro units. So go ahead and select which strategies you feel are appropriate.
And while you're filling that out, I'll just add the RHNA number is scheduled to be finalized in February of 2021.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, interesting. 69% liked tiny homes and micro units, and 62% increased densities near transit, and then a tie, 46% for ADUs and motel conversions. So thank you for your input.
Okay, we're going to take another break for live questions. So at this point, you're all familiar. We're going to take about 3 before we move on. And you can raise your hand, and Xavier will call on you. At the moment, we don't have any questions. We'll give it a moment. Oh, okay. See one.
Tamala, please go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions actually. You gave a breakdown of each portion of the element with very low income, et cetera. Is there more detail in the housing element on how each of those segments are planned to be created? Because higher cost units are going to be created in a different way that the low income units are going to be created, for example. And is there also detail in the housing element of how in the past they've been brought into the city and how that's been done? And then my second question is, I noticed that on the questionnaire about how to build more housing in the city, that was not mentioned was mixed use buildings. And we've had a few of those brought into the city. And so if you could speak more to mixed use buildings, and in particular, the old IKEA site, we get questions on that all the time. And I'm wondering if there's any updates on that particular site and if there will be a large number of residential units that will be put into that site and how many of them will be in the different elements of low income, medium income, et cetera.
Great. Thank you, Tamala. I'll take the first one on how is lower income produced. So the housing element statutes allow us, when we're looking at the sites inventory, to use what's referred to as default densities. So for Burbank, any site that has a minimum density of 30 units an acre can be credited towards its very low and low income needs. And any site for moderate income that is 12 units an acre or above. Now, it certainly doesn't mean that a 30 unit an acre market rate project is going to be affordable to very low and low. Most likely it would not. But the city is, again, setting the table through zoning to allow an affordable developer to come in and build at that density. The city has what's called an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which is going through an update now that requires a certain percentage of deed restricted affordable units within projects, 10 units or more. So that's one way that affordable units are provided. The state has more funding right now for affordable production than I've seen in a long time. So that is available for typically nonprofits that are interested in building affordable projects on multifamily sites. And the mixed use, I'll kick that over to Fred, but we should have added the word mixed use. I think we kind of assume that higher density housing near transit is mixed use, but we didn't actually include the words there. So Fred, I'll let you talk to the old IKEA site.
Sure. So as it relates to the old IKEA, there was a project proposal. I've been with the city now almost 4 years. When I first started here, that was basically Burbank Town Center North as a mixed-use project. We were looking at over 1,000 units to be developed on the site, and that was part of, or hand in hand with, the renovation work that was being done to the mall itself, so that it would kind of be what we used to call in the business lifestyle centers. They're basically both shopping, living, entertainment, all in one. Unfortunately, result of COVID, you're all aware that the mall is pretty much, other than if they have exit points, most of the retailers in the mall are shut down, including the theaters. So the property owners are reevaluating the feasibility of repurposing the mall. So we are not sure what that would mean going forward. But with that said, as part of the downtown specific plan update, we are reaching out to all property owners, all stakeholders, to take a look at those sites, those large sites. It's over 34 acres of land, to see what is the long-term, not only viability, but also long-term goal consistent with the city's efforts to look at housing as a potential infill use in that location, amongst others. So participating in the downtown specific plan will probably give us all collectively, as well as all the participants, a better insight on what happens forward. And that's an opportunity to actually provide input as residents and stakeholders as well as to possible areas. So I think one of the things you're seeing is the question of, where, I think people have asked the question, where is the best place to put housing? These areas are in close proximity to transit centers. When we talk about Golden State, there's 2 out in that area. We have our larger transit facility that has a high rate of use in downtown. So like La Terra, that is probably within a quarter mile of that location. Those are areas that developers in the city are looking at to take advantage of access to public transit and existing infrastructure to be able to develop those sites. So I guess with BTC, with Burbank Town Center, it's a wait and see. But during that process, we have a long-range planning effort over the next year where the community will be able to also provide their input as to maybe that being a possible site for additional infill mixed-use residential development.
Okay, thank you. And I think thank you for the question. We're gonna continue with the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Lexi Journey with Rincon. And as part of the housing element update, the state is requiring that cities consider environmental justice when developing policies in the general plan. So environmental justice is defined in Senate Bill 1000 as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So in other words, the goal of environmental justice is to prevent the development of environmental policies that could unfairly impact communities that are considered disadvantaged. So the first part of addressing environmental justice that the state has laid out is that the community first needs to identify which communities are considered disadvantaged in the city. Some examples of how disadvantaged communities can be identified include seeing if people in the community have differences in exposure to pollution, differences in income levels, more or less health issues, less access to healthy food, and looking at the age of certain individuals as well. Being that older people are potentially more vulnerable to different impacts. So the map at the right shows information provided by the state that looks at these factors and more, and designates areas that are considered more disadvantaged than others, as shown in the dark orange and red areas you can see in the map. Those are what the state is designating as disadvantaged communities. So the city is using this map as a starting point to identify disadvantaged communities. And Lisa will talk about this more at the end of the presentation, but the city is putting on a survey that's at the project website, And there are specific questions about environmental justice issues and where disadvantaged communities are in the city in the survey. So please fill out the survey to provide your feedback on this topic. After disadvantaged communities are identified with input from the community, the city will then develop policies aimed at three main goals. One, reducing health risks in these communities. Two, promoting civic engagement, so ensuring that there's equal access to the planning process for all communities. And three, prioritizing improvements and programs to occur in or for disadvantaged communities. So like I said, please go to the project website and provide your input on how the city can best address environmental justice and achieve these goals. But while we're together, I did want to ask you one polling question about environmental justice. In evaluating strategies to address environmental justice issues faced by Burbank's low-income and disadvantaged communities, which of the following environmental justice issues do you see as being the highest priority? And you can select more than one. All right, looks like most people filled out the poll. A few more, I'll give it a few more seconds. So it looks like high housing costs was voted as the highest priority, followed by public health, environmental pollution, and then unemployment and linguistic isolation. Thank you for filling that out. And like I said, please go to the survey to provide more feedback.
So this will bring us to our last short break for questions on the material just presented regarding environmental justice. If anyone has questions at this time on that, we'll take those before we move on. No questions so far. I'll give it just another moment.
Bruce, go on ahead and ask your question, please.
Just a quick question, back to when you were discussing about the old IKEA building, there was something mentioned about, I think it was 34-acre property. That IKEA building isn't 34-acre property. Was that the whole mall that you were referring to as looking into maybe future housing, turning the mall into future housing? Is that what I was sort of understanding there? That's my question. Thank you.
To keep the focus on environmental justice, I'll just say quickly, it's inclusive of the whole mall proper. In other words, IKEA and the rest of the developments, including those across and adjacent to the freeway, in and out, the furniture stores, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I seeing no other questions on environmental justice. Oh, looks like we have one actually. Okay.
David, go on ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah, I'm just curious if anybody noticed a correlation to those high impact areas that, the media centers are actually right in the middle of those. Just being a VFX artist myself, actually having worked in that area, I'm just curious if anybody realizes that the entertainment industry is kind of hire to fire. It has a very high turnaround. You work on a movie, a show, you get let go. That's how it works. Maybe 3-6 months on average. So just curious.
Yeah, I think that's a good note, and that's the exact type of feedback that we're looking for in terms of seeing every community is very different, and Burbank is very special in that way with having such high media industry. So getting feedback like that helps the city to develop policies that can potentially mitigate those impacts, at least bring it to the attention of the city.
Thank you, David, for that comment. So seeing no other questions or comments at this moment, we're just going to begin our general question and comment period. So we're going to open it up, and it's about 12:15. So this is scheduled till 12:30, but if there are those with questions still at that point, we can maybe stay on for a few more minutes. And then otherwise, as I mentioned, you can send questions through the Q&A, or you can send an email, which I'll reiterate that address at the end as well. But at this point, if you have any other general questions or comments relating to anything you heard today, now is the time. You can raise your hand, and we'll scan the list and see if anybody wants to bring anything else up.
Go ahead, Karen, with your question or comment.
I was wondering, as we look at the very large companies that are employers in our city and companies like Netflix that would be coming in, can anyone speak to the amount of the amount of contribution they make, or any kind of initiatives that these companies help fund to create housing for their own employees?
Fred or Karen, do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Not that I'm not aware of anything specifically that they've come forward with. I think we've heard from employees at those locations and an interest to want to be closer to their place of employment. So yeah, I think it's all, I haven't heard anything specifically. We just know that when we do interact with representatives from these companies, they are very supportive of opportunities to facilitate housing near and around their employment centers to be able to provide kind of a wraparound quality of life for their employees. So so yeah, I'm not too sure of any contributions. I know I've seen of other stuff, maybe state or national, all right, with certain of the large companies that have put funds aside to build housing. But specifically here in Burbank, I'm not aware of anything, but we will check with our economic development division within community development to see if there's any efforts that we may have overlooked.
That would be okay. I just think that there are examples from other companies like Microsoft or Facebook that have done this, and I feel like Netflix and Disney are right up there in terms of the size of company that could afford it, and that the city can really work with to get all that they can from them.
And this is Karen. Many years ago, at least 10 years ago, I was involved in a study here where we interviewed the major employers in town and asked what they were doing to help house employees. And at least two of the large entertainment companies had some employee assistance for housing, be it first-time home buyer assistance or rental assistance. One of the other things on the survey that Lexi mentioned, we have questions about potential new housing programs for the city to look at. And on that list is a commercial impact fee. So that that's something that, some cities have. It's a little more popular in the Bay Area. That requires new commercial development to pay a fee that is then put aside in the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund to produce affordable units.
And just to add to Karen's comment, one of the other efforts that the city's undertaking, there's a lot of efforts being undertaken over this next year, is looking at our development impact fees and see what opportunities exist in a similar way to, as development comes on board, to have them assist or provide fair share funding for different things, whether it's community services, infrastructure, and even potentially for new residential development.
Gina, go on ahead and ask your question or comment.
Great, thank you. I have a question about schools. What do you anticipate the impact for all these extra units being to schools, A? And then secondly, do you anticipate this impacting people who work in Burbank but don't live in Burbank but can apply for their kids to come to schools? That's it.
I can help answer the first question. So as we talked about earlier for the environmental impact report, schools is something that is included in that assessment. So we talk to the schools and see how they're projecting their growth and looking at how this housing element, the potential growth from it, could impact schools. And so we have a discussion and evaluate that. So that'll be something that we'll definitely be looking into in the near future.
And just to add to Lexi's comment, whenever we do get one of these larger developments that comes through the process, over the past 4 years in particular, we've actually reached out to Burbank Unified School District and their demographers just to verify both enrollment rates and capacity, and that's something that'll continue to be ongoing. I can only tell you based on my own experience having a 9-year-old that I'm in the city of LA, and one of the things I hear quite a bit is declining enrollment and the need to be able to keep the teachers. So I think to the point in the city of Burbank is that there's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy of you need new kids to come into the system to be able to kind of in essence backfill that enrollment. As a result of that, you have vacancies in the student population, and as you mentioned, it's being backfilled with these additional students that are able to kind of come into the system. So it's something that's going to be an ongoing discussion with Burbank Unified School District, and it also is going to be part of our assessment through the environmental review to look at housing that's being projected, and what the growth-inducing impacts are to that, and how it can be supported with the different services, including schools within the city of Burbank.
Mary, please go on ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you. This is Mary Catone from the Burbank YMCA. I just wanted to add to that comment about schools and ask, will there be any consideration for the impact that the new housing will have on the early care and education, specifically children ages 0 to 5? I bring that up because there's a lot of mechanisms, I think, for infrastructure and K-12 education, but often this segment is missed. We did kind of stumble upon gaps in the infant care specifically that hit crisis levels in 2018 in Burbank and had a direct impact on kind of the economic participation of their parents. And so I just would urge us all to consider this as well. And I know that in the workforce housing, that demographic, the 25 to 44, is usually, that's the segment of young adult that upon beginning a family, infant care becomes their first introduction to, their neighborhood. So I just want to throw that into the mix as well, or I'm curious, if child care and child care centers and early education would be considered in looking at this housing element cycle.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really good comment. I will say that traditionally in our review assessments, we haven't looked at that type of age group with most, but there's no reason why we can't. So we'll make a note of that and evaluate that in the EIR as well. So thank you for providing that comment.
Thank you.
And I'll just chime in as well. I will say we might address that in the EIR, or maybe it'll be addressed elsewhere. But I think hearing that comment, I think there are various avenues that the cities can use to address that type of topic. It might be the CEQA review, but it might be something else.
Tamala, please go on ahead with your question or comment.
Great, thank you. I had a couple questions. The first one is about ADUs. It was mentioned earlier that 350 permits have been submitted for the ADUs, and I'm wondering how many of these permits are actually for new ADUs that have been built, and how many of them are actually ADU units that weren't up to code, or where basically the owner is bringing them up to code, and that's when they were submitting their. I know that we have some examples in our local neighborhood where there were ADUs that were not licensed, and so now they're being licensed. And then the second question I had, actually back on the ADUs, and where are the new ADUs in the city? Where are the new ADUs being built? And then the second question I had was connecting two of the comments earlier. So one of the earlier comments was about asking about commercial assistance in housing, which was a great question. And someone also mentioned that a number of our single people who live alone residents are actually on projects for the studios, and they're not here very long, and then they move somewhere else. And I'm wondering, putting those two together, especially now during COVID, when a lot more of our people who work in Burbank are working remotely, and so there's may not be as much of a demand to commute in after COVID to these large job providers, that there might be an opportunity here for them to provide like on-campus housing for these short-term workers who are only working for a year, for example, that they could build actually on the commercial property, that then would ease up a little of the pressure for the smaller units that are going to be more permanent for our residents who are staying here longer, and the ones who are here just for projects can be on-campus housing. I'm just putting that out there as a question. Is that even possible? Is that something that the larger commercial entities could consider? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamala, for those great questions and comments. This is Lisa. I'll just start with the ADUs to begin with, and then we can start collectively unpack the second points. I don't know the exact number offhand. I don't know if any staff here does, but I think anecdotally what we've seen is it's primarily people either building new detached ADUs in their rear yard or converting a garage. I think here and there, we understand that code enforcement has worked with some folks to see if they could potentially legalize, but my sense is that's been far fewer of those, is that our ADUs are primarily from new units being generated, again, either converting existing accessory structures or garages, or just new construction. And then as far as where, it's a really great point. I think one of our staff has been collecting the addresses and trying, I think we're going to be putting that into a map. Anyone that's on from staff, feel free to chime in, but I think we can look at that once we kind of have all of the, our folks from GIS help us put that all together.
Lisa, this is Scott Planback. This is Deputy City Planner Scott Planback. And is to jump in on the ADU question. You are correct. Most of the ADUs we get, we don't have an exact number as to what's been, once were maybe another type of unit converted, as opposed to units that were new or that are built new and converted from a garage. But the vast majority of the units we do see fall in one or two categories. Either they've been garage conversions. We see quite a few garage conversions, and then we see people who build new units. As for the distribution of ADUs, we did put together a map that was presented to the planning board a couple of weeks ago that showed a pretty good distribution of ADUs, and that's something we can share with the group later, or we can provide the link for that later on, the link to the map.
Perfect, thank you, Scott. And then on the second point, I don't know, Fred or anyone, did you want to comment on that? I think it's a creative idea. Just broadly speaking, I guess, in terms of COVID and how that will impact some people's commuting or living preferences, I think it's still all kind of unfolding before us, but I think we're definitely going to need to look at that as we move forward into this process.
I think, Lisa, you're on point. It's something, I mean, they're really good points. Those are things that we'd have to engage those large employers, and I think through future discussions or stakeholder meetings, we can broach that question with them and see kind of where they stand on that issue.
Great, thank you. So we're just touching on 12:30 here. So if there are questions that come to anyone after this or during, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to just make some final comments, and then I'll also provide the project webpage and the email address. So just to go over next steps briefly, we are going to be launching, as Lexi mentioned and Karen mentioned, a survey that will focus on the housing element and some environmental justice questions. And that's actually live on the project webpage now, which I'm going to be providing again in just a moment. But we definitely encourage you all to fill it out. It'll be really helpful for us to get that kind of input, and then to also feel free to send it around to your friends and other residents that you know, so that we can get as many people as possible to get that feedback. And then we're going to be holding a community workshop, as I referenced earlier, and that's going to focus more specifically on the housing sites inventory, and that we don't have a specific date yet, but please stay tuned, and in all likelihood, it'll probably be somewhere around December, thereabout. And then after that, we would be looking at starting the draft housing and safety element preparation, as well as undertaking the required CEQA review, California Environmental Quality Act, and the preparation of the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report that was referenced a couple times today. And then ultimately, we'll bring this back to the Planning Board and the City Council for hearings and adoption. And that date reference there came up at the beginning, and we'll reiterate it here, that that's the deadline, October 2021, for the state in order for us to get our housing element certified. And then with that, I think we can go to the final slide. So again, we just want to thank you all for participating and attending today. We hope you found it useful, and we appreciate your feedback. The email that we're using that you can send any follow-up questions or comments or thoughts that you have is housingelement@burbankca.gov. And then if you prefer to call, the Planning Division email or phone number is 818-238-5250. And you can ask for me if you'd like. And this is Lisa speaking, by the way. And then again, we have the survey that we encourage you all to take, and that's available as of now. It's already live on burbankhousingelement.com. So www.burbankhousingelement.com, and the screenshot shown here, you'll see at the top, you can click take the survey, and it'll launch it for you. And with that, I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything, but again, thank you for your time, and we hope you'll continue to participate throughout this process.
Thank you very, very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone.